Chapter 1. Seeing Clearly, Why We Begin with Science. There is no such thing as a thing. There are only events. Carlo Rovelli. We begin where solidity seems least questionable. Understanding reality begins with noticing how things actually work. Science formalized that instinct. It asks simple questions. What is this made of? What changes when something else changes? And follows the answers wherever they lead. There is nothing mystical about it, just attention, patience, evidence. Modern neuroscience starts with that attitude and discovers that the world we experience is not delivered whole to the mind. It is built. The brain fills in gaps, predicts what should be there, corrects itself, and forms a usable picture. Perception is a construction. The sense of being a stable, independent self is another construction. Useful, familiar, but not fundamental. Physics arrives at a similar conclusion on a much larger scale. What people once imagined as solid matter turns out to be energy taking temporary form. At its foundation, the universe is not built out of isolated pieces, but out of relationships, fields interacting, patterns forming and dissolving. Energy, the most basic ingredient we have words for, is not a substance. It is a capacity for change, a property of interaction. Matter arises from energy when conditions stabilize it long enough to appear solid. This is worth pausing on. Energy is not solidity. Solidity is an emergent description at certain scales. Everything we call matter is what energy looks like when certain conditions hold. That is not mysticism. That is contemporary physics. It implies that nothing, neither particles nor people, exists independently. Everything depends on something else to appear as it does. Long before physics could describe energy fields or quantum events, a French thinker named René Descartes tried to understand experience by stripping away assumptions. He lived in the 1600s, an era when knowledge was shaped mostly by tradition and theology. He asked what remained true if he doubted everything he had inherited. His method was crude by today's standards, but the posture mattered. Clear the table. Examine experience directly. That posture is older than Descartes and older than science. It is a basic human movement. Question what you were told, look at what is actually happening, and let the conclusions come from observation rather than belief. If you follow that movement far enough, past the brain, past matter, past cultural expectations, you end up in the same territory where the Buddha found himself 25 centuries ago. But this book does not approach the Buddha as a religious figure, nor does it treat his teaching as dogma. The interest is not in Buddhism as a religion, with its rituals, ceremonies, and symbolic world. The interest is in the insight itself, what a human being discovered by looking directly at experience. The Buddha awakened alone. He had no scripture to study, no doctrine to follow. He examined his own mind the way a scientist examines a natural system. What arises? What follows it? What causes it to change? He found that sensations shape feelings. Feelings shape craving. Craving shapes clinging. And clinging gives rise to suffering. He found that when the chain weakens at any point, the whole structure loosens. He taught using the worldview and vocabulary available in 5th century BCE India, long before any accurate scientific understanding of the world. After his death, his spoken teachings were remembered, recited, debated, and eventually written down several centuries later. Over the next 2.5 millennia, different cultures built monasteries, rituals, statues, ceremonies, and devotional traditions to preserve them. These traditions carried the teaching through political ruptures and historical collapse, and without them the Buddha's insight might not have survived. But they also added layers, sometimes helpful, sometimes obscuring. In many places today, what people call Buddhism is mostly ritual, offerings for good fortune, chants for merit, ceremonies for protection. These practices hold cultural or psychological meaning, but they are far removed from the original inquiry into mind and suffering. When symbols replace investigation, the teaching becomes opaque. The Dalai Lama has warned about this repeatedly. If Buddhism becomes ritual without understanding, he says, it becomes superstition, and if scientific knowledge contradicts some inherited Buddhist belief, then Buddhism must update, not science. This is not a ode to modernity. It is fidelity to the spirit of inquiry the Buddha himself embodied. He adapted his explanations to the intellectual world he lived in. If he lived now, he would use ours. This book follows that orientation. It does not treat the Buddha's teaching as religious truth or dogma. It treats it as a method, an approach to understanding experience and ending suffering. Science helps clarify that method, not by validating it, but by revealing the same underlying structure. Physics shows that matter is a temporary configuration of energy, empty of inherent substance. Neuroscience shows that the self is a constructed model, empty of independent core. The Buddha observed that suffering arises from misinterpreting these constructions as solid, personal, or permanent. In modern terms, mistaking models for reality. This is where science and contemplative insight meet. Science describes how phenomena arise. The Buddha described how clinging to those phenomena becomes suffering. Only the latter addresses liberation. This chapter begins with the universe not to explain its origin, but to loosen our present intuition that anything, including the self, is inherently solid. When we see that galaxies are temporary patterns, and thoughts are temporary patterns, emptiness stops sounding like a doctrine. It becomes a description, a clean one. Emptiness does not mean nothingness. It means no independent essence. It means relationship instead of isolation, process instead of substance. Physics, biology, neuroscience, and the Buddha all converge on this point, though for different reasons and with different aims. Partly begins here, at the scale of energy and matter, because it is the widest layer of the same conditional structure that eventually appears in the mind as the illusion of self. Understanding the outer layer makes the inner layer easier to recognize. When the solidity of the universe softens, the solidity of the self becomes easier to question, and with that, the path of liberation begins to open. The rest of this book follows from that opening. If everything arises from conditions, every thought, every emotion, every identity, every physical form, then freedom begins not with belief, but with understanding, clear seeing, nothing more and nothing less.